Hey y'all, I'm Kelly Moody and you're listening to the Ground Shots podcast, an audio project exploring our relationship to ecology through conversations and storytelling with farmers, herbalists, craftspeople, naturalists, artists, and more. I'm currently sitting drinking my coffee early in the morning here in northern Idaho. I've been at the homestead of Jim and Melody Croft for the past couple weeks, and every time I come here I'm just so moved by the experience and reminded of so many things. And it's usually the same time of year, and I'm usually thinking about the same things but in different ways, and I reflect on where I was the first time I ever came here. And Jim Croft is a medieval bookbinder. Of all things, I tell people that, they're like, what? When I say medieval era, it basically means like books made in these older styles, mostly medieval era European style books, but often some of these styles that he utilizes were used in different cultures and stuff in different ways. The gist of it is that the materials were more basic in certain ways at that time, so he's really interested in the way that the book can be a piece of the land. So we're not just making a book, we're participating in the transformation of things from one form to the other, and that's always been an interest of mine. We're spinning flax, but we're also processing the flax from stalk, and also working with some other fibers, nettles, dogbane, hops, hemp, and we are working wood for the boards that cover our books, like the covers. I am really fascinated by wood grain and the different ways to carve and work with different trees, and like how the tree's life is reflected in the wood, and as you work it you really experience a different relationship with the plant, and to see then too the plant become something that protects your words, if you write in your book. It's really magical. We also been making things with bone. Jim is really into that. He gets the carcasses of elk in the hunting season from a neighbor who tans hides and processes elk and deer, and so he has a bunch of bone here he has processed to a point. I would love to be a part of the processing, because I've always heard that eating them in that way isn't a good thing, but he's been doing it for so long, and I see how amazing his tools are. So in book binding, bone is utilized to fold things and to tuck things and to paste things and to get into tiny little crevices to sort of construct this thing that becomes another entity. We've been making paper as well out of hemp and flax and rags. That's really the way the paper kind of began, was old clothing, rotting old clothing. And we've been cutting up blue jeans and sheets and nets, cotton nets. He collects things everywhere. He's such an interesting scavenger. I think about that episode I did with Amy of Scavenge Magic, and this concept of scavenging for natural dyes, or scavenging old clothes that other people don't want and turning it into something else, and he definitely does that as well, but often turns it into paper. And it's really neat to see that process transform. I've done big bouts of paper making over the years here and there, and it's still such a magical, amazing process. I've been doing the leather portion of the class, and a lot of old books had parchment or vellum or different leathers in the book in some form, and sometimes really finely done and sometimes crudely done. So, a lot of people now, when they try to do this sort of work, they really are really perfect about it, and actually historically people were not very perfect about it. I've been interested in hide tanning for a while, maybe since 2011 or 12, and I didn't grow up with that or anything. I grew up in this rural area where people hunted and stuff, but no one really did that. No one even really tanned small pelts or anything. I never noticed anyways. I wasn't interested in that when I was growing up. I was interested in skateboarding and painting. I got interested in that living in Asheville, North Carolina, when I was during one period where I was intensely studying herbal medicine. I ended up living next door to someone who was teaching classes on hide tanning, so I ended up taking a class and then ended up living with a bunch of people there who were tanning all the time, and so it got to experiment and ask questions and be around people who were working through that process in different ways. So I picked that up as an interest, and I really like the way that plants can intersect the preservation of an animal's skin and the way other elements influence that transformational process. And even though it's a really gross primal process that feels kind of like unromantic in certain ways, and I guess it's kind of romantic in other ways, carrying something from one form to the other for me is like my spirituality, I guess. So like turning garments into paper, or turning an elk's leg bone into a tool you can use, or a button, or spinning this flax stalk into fiber you can bind your book with, or weave with, or crochet a bag with. I really appreciate that process with animal skins as well. Really reflecting on how I've made it to where I am and the process of continuously moving through different landscapes and moving into different little worlds and realities and seeing into them and kind of but suddenly becoming a participant in a reality and then being pulled out of that reality. And so this reality is one that is familiar yet is part of my journey, moving from one place to the next. And I am parked in a spot that I've parked before and looking at plants that I've seen before during this time of year. And there's something to those layers, you know, the way that I've been doing it on the road. And it hasn't been a continuous, like, I'm constantly moving every single day. There's been big periods where I was living with an ex-partner for a few months here and there, and like traveling with him for periods, and it's looked a lot of different ways. A lot of what's drawn me is to see places in these layers, and there's something that feels deep about that. Coming here again, and the yarrow blooming, the St. John's wort popped while I was here. It felt like familiar. I kind of knew it was going to happen. You know, I knew the Saskatoons were going to ripen while I was here. I just knew the intimate little minute things that were going to occur. This episode of the podcast is a conversation with Steven Edholm. We recorded this conversation in the spring and we focused it on bark tanning leather, so it's pretty fitting for the summer and what my project has been here at Jim and Melody's during Jim's Old Ways of Making Books class. Been teaching bark tanning, brain tanning, and parchment, and so I have been telling my students, you should listen to this podcast when I put it out because it's so informative, and Steven knows so much more about this process than me and has been doing it for so many more years. So this conversation with Steven is a bit geeky at times. If you're really interested in the minute details of the process of turning an animal skin into leather, this is definitely the episode for you. We really get into the alchemy of it and like all the factors and variables, but also we get into some philosophy about it all and bigger picture things, so it's not all so technical. I welcome you to listen through it even if you have never tanned anything before and you don't have any context for it. I think the way that Steven explains it is pretty thorough and contextualized and meaningful. So yeah, it's definitely a really wonderful audio resource, and I appreciate Steven sitting down and getting geeky with me and letting me ask a million questions I've been wanting to ask someone who knows a lot about it. So yeah, enjoy this episode. Earth burn, burn with the light that reveals our faces. Burn, burn with the heat that will warm
am Steven Edholm. We're on my 40-acre homestead in the coastal mountains of Northern California. And here, this is like a palette, an artist's palette and experimental laboratory for self-reliance skills is kind of how I see it.
Awesome. And you run something called Skillcult. Will you explain a little bit of what that is?
Yeah, Skillcult is my kind of lifetime project, ultimate lifetime project to just bring together all the knowledge I've accumulated and the skills that I've accumulated, not just skills in doing things and understanding things, but at exploring new things and having this kind of background that I can exploit now to learn new things really quickly. And I do a lot of video, mostly YouTube. I have a blog. We doing some, I'm trying to always get around to writing books. And my mission is basically to get everything out of my head that's already in there and get that out into the world and just constantly be exploring new ideas and pushing the limits of what I'm already interested in or new things I get interested in.
What are some of the types of things that you're teaching through your video series and stuff on Skillcult?
Well, I'll probably be expanding a lot more. Like I haven't done very much primitive skills yet, even though I have a big background in that and will be. Typical, I've kind of got stuck on certain subjects people know me for. Like they probably think of my channel as the axes and apples channel. So I do a lot on apples. I breed apples, I collect apples. I'm just kind of interested in apples as sort of the king of homestead fruits for, practical temperate region fruit. And axes, I got really into axes. I just love axes, so I started cutting all my wood, firewood with axes and no saws. And now I've like talked a bunch of other people into doing it. And there's a thing called the cordwood challenge, where you cut a certain amount of wood with axes only. I talk about biochar a lot and other agricultural related stuff, gardening, things like that, and tanning, lots of tanning too. And I'll be doing a lot more of tanning for sure. There's a strong interest. It's a long time strong interest of mine, and it needs work. Like there's a lot of holes that need to be filled and development that I think should happen
in the culture of tanning in general.
In the culture of tanning, in the culture in general, and moving toward a viable micro tannery movement is what I want to see. I want to see a micro tannery movement similar to brewing, like microbreweries or any other kind of small artisan type of craft.
What do you feel like is the reason why that hasn't caught on yet?
Well, one reason is access to cheap leather, and most cheap leather really is cheap. I mean, it's not good leather. It's kind of a waste of hides in many cases. Like the average commercial tan deer hide is pretty much a waste of a hide. I mean, they pickle it so much that the skin is super weak, but it just allows them to get these hides through the process super fast. But within a few years, you can practically tear them in half. They feel terrible. They're clammy because they're all chrome tan. They're ugly. They're like a horrible, like orangish yellow color. They don't smell good. There's really nothing to recommend them at all. So access to cheap leather is one. It's a lot of work. In order for it to be viable, it's going to be definitely a sort of artisan type of a situation where people are going to have to produce these hides and be able to sell them for quite a high price. Like compared to competing with the market in general, that's not an option. It's going to have to be more of an artisan thing. But on the other hand, there are people out there who are going to be willing to pay for that. There's a lot of artisans working in leather that are going to want those products because they're 100% natural, done by these traditional methods. Once you get them and you feel them and you smell them,
you can't go back.
It's just not the same. The closest thing we have on the market I can think of right now is you can get good bark tan leather, like good tooling leather. That's the type of a product you could produce in a micro tannery. But still, there's a whole train of thought or a school of thought that pit tanned bark tanned leather, especially like cattle hide, pit tanned cattle hide for tooling leather and saddles and stuff, is superior. I can't address that really out of experience yet, but I suspect that they're right. And pit tanning is a different process. It's like you layer the skin with layers of bark and you leave it for a longer period of time. So you're not getting the skins through the process as quickly. And that's a whole conversation we could have about the history of tanning and how it was this artisan crafts thing where people had their method that they usually didn't share, and it was kept within the tannery. And there were like master tanners, and they learned from tanners who learned from tanners who learned from tanners, and they just innovate very slowly. But eventually science came into the picture, and people who became leather chemists who were not tanners, and their focus was efficiency. They're like, you're wasting materials, we can do this faster, let's try this, acid, let's try this method and make this happen in 20 days instead of a year or two, and a lot of the tanners originally were resistant to this idea. The traditional tanners are like, no, it's not as good, this is how we do it, we do it this way for a reason. And guess who won? Basically we ended up with a lot of cheap crappy leather, but we can crank it out in huge quantities.
Quantity over quality.
Yeah, well, some of it is okay. I mean, your shoes, a lot of shoes are made with, good leather in air quotes, but a lot of it isn't too. There's a lot of cheap leather that is essentially, again, it's kind of a waste of the resource of the hide, like taking that hide and saying, well, we're just going to kind of make this throwaway quickie product out of it that really isn't even going to outlast the soles of your shoes.
Maybe start with just briefly explaining your experience with tanning first before we get really into the details.
Okay. Let me try to summarize my development in general.
Okay.
So in high school, I was, in the punk scene, and I was listening to a lot of this radical punk rock with kind of these radical self-governance type of ideologies. And eventually I just kind of came to this conclusion that I needed to learn how to take care of myself. Like, if you're going to self-govern, you can't be a livestock. You can't be being relying on the system and getting everything you need from the system that you don't like. So by 16, I was looking for information on homesteading. That seemed like the logical way to go. Couldn't find any, basically. As soon as I got out of high school, I got interested in primitive skills. I dove heavy into that through like my 20s and early 30s. And over time, I just kind of eventually sort of migrated back to other self-reliance skills and homesteading. So during my primitive skills phase, I got into tanning right away, and it was brain tanning. It's like that's what was there, and it just seemed like me and a lot of other people's attitude was like brain tan is the way to go. It's the bee's knees, and everything else is like, yeah, whatever. Even bark tanning just wasn't that interesting because it was just this concept we had that brain tan was superior to everything. So I got really into that, and I got really into wet scraping, which very few people were doing, like much fewer people. And I would occasionally meet someone who had learned to brain tan on their own that did wet scraping versus dry scraping. Dry scraping, you dry the hide in a frame and you dry it and you scrape it with a scraper while it's dry. And wet scraping, you throw the hide on a beam and scrape it with kind of a double-handed knife. I wrote a book with that with my partner at the time, Tamara Wilder. We wrote that in the 90s, and we started a business called Paleotechnics, which was kind of just a broad name for doing old stuff. We did mostly primitive skills, Stone Age type stuff and tanning, but it was kind of intended to have a little bit broader compass. So over time, I just decided, I needed a place to be. I was, gardening and more intensively got into fruit trees and grafting and all that stuff, and finally ended up here on this 40-acre homestead. Basically, writing this book was a year of our lives, and it was intensive and it was intense. It was like a really intense process to go through, and just being really dedicated and making this book as good as we could. I would say it's probably the most complete, most comprehensive, in-depth home tanning book ever written.
I mean, y'all did all the drawings and
yeah,
so much.
Especially considering that it's on a narrow subject. For better or worse, that I think that's true. And it was this intense process. By the time I got done with it, honestly, I was just sick of the idea of brain tanning. I'd also been brain tanning for money for years. You know, we'd produce like so many hides a year, take them to places where people would actually pay almost enough to make it worth it, not really. And yeah, it's just a hard way to go. A lot of people have learned that, trying to brain tan for money.
It's hard on your body to be pumping
Yeah,
out stuff like that.
yeah. So right around that time is when I really started to dig into bark tanning. And let me tell you a story that's real interesting. Quite a while before the book was even written, I was doing a lot of brain tanning, and my neighbor was a firewood cutter, and he cut a lot of tan oak, which is a oak that was traditionally used for tanning leather. And the bark would just fall off, and he would burn it in his burn pile. So I went over there and just got like a bunch of it and brought it home. Like, I should do something with this. And it sat around for a while, and I was just kind of, I was a brain tanner. I was stuck on that. So one time I had this piece of elk hide, and it was just like a small piece. I don't know where it came from, and I had soaked it in water for way too long, and then soaked it some more. I mean, it was bad. Like, it smelled like a septic tank. This is the kind of thing that
Been
tanners
there.
out there, you shouldn't handle these things. Even if you're gonna handle them at all,
Gloves.
you should
Yeah.
wear gloves. But really, you should dig a hole, dump it in there. I mean, I've seen people get serious infections from these things, and I have too, actually. But for whatever reason, I thought, well, this is totally screwed up. Why not just throw it in some bark? So I boiled up some pieces of bark or something, and I put this thing on the beam, and I started scraping it, and it was kind of like starting to fall apart. So what it looked like was, there's like the flesh layer and the hair side layer, and in between it was dissolving into this like gooey cottage cheese stuff that like squished around, and there were like ulcers, like big ulcers opened up in the flesh side where
Oh
you
my
could
god.
see underneath into this inner cottage cheesy layer, right? And I was like, this is basically falling apart, but the stuff is right there. Why don't I just throw it in? So I threw it in there. Sometime later, I pull it out, and it was almost like all that stuff healed up. It
Whoa.
didn't smell anymore. It just had this kind of like strong but intriguing fermented smell. And it's almost like the tannins just knit it all back together. And you could kind of see that it was messed up on the flesh side, but nothing like it had looked like before. So I just kind of dried that. I didn't know what to do with it. I probably oiled it a little bit, and I used that as a napping pad. So I was breaking, you put it on your leg to protect your leg when you're breaking flint and obsidian to make stone tools, which is, it's really sharp, and you need something to protect your leg or your pants become shredded. So I used it for that for years, and then I remember hanging it in a tree for a year or two, just leaving it outside because I was too lazy to move it. Totally fine. I
Wow.
still have it, and it's still a functional piece of leather. It's not exactly pretty.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a eureka moment for me. I was just like, wow, that was like magic. And not only that, you have this product that is not skin, and it's not tannin or bark. It's this union. And there's ways to reverse it, like chemical ways to reverse that bond, but basically it's a permanent bond. And so, while if I take a piece of raw skin and I throw it in my compost pile, which I frequently do as a tanner, it's just gone so fast. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, this is like a perfect petri dish for decay and raising bacteria. But if I take a piece of bark tanned leather and throw it in the compost, which again I frequently do because I have little scraps and whatever leftover shoe soles and stuff, I can pull that out year after year and just keep throwing it back in, and it just looks maybe a little worse every year or two, and eventually it's going to decay. But you can literally leave the stuff on the ground for years. In fact, there was a shipwreck, I think it was about 200 years ago. It was discovered in the 80s, and it was carrying a cargo of Russian leather. So this ship sinks. 200 years later, they dredge these hides up. I've seen them in person, and recondition them, and they sell them to people, and they make stuff out of them.
Whoa.
They're incredible. I mean, that was Russian leather, which is treated with birch tar, which is extra preservative. But bark tan in general is just amazingly durable.
I've kind of had that experience a little bit with a hide that I overbucked, which we're not gonna. Well, we'll be talking about that a little bit, but changing the pH of the hide to get the hair off. And I was like, I don't know if this thing is still good. It's like weird smelling, and I was like, well, it had little holes starting to form,
The little pits,
yeah.
bacterial pitting,
I can
those
show
are
you
colonies of bacteria that get started.
some of the ones that I haven't showed you had that on it from. overbucking. And I just was like, well, I have a lot of bark brew. So I was like, well, let me just see what happens. And yeah, I was able to like turn them back the other way, and they don't look as good, obviously,
Right.
as they would if you had done it the proper way or whatever. But I was like, wow, yeah, just kind of reverse that rot. Super cool.
Yeah, it's incredible stuff. Then that's one of the things I try to do or would like to do. I'm not sure how possible it is just to communicate that excitement and that love of the process that people get once they go through it. And people get it with brain tanning too. It's very similar, just to watch this transformation of this, like, potentially really gross, often really gross at numerous points due to the process. And
Just part of it.
to watch it transform into this fluffy white thing and brain tan and then to smoke it. And I think with bark tan, it's just more so. It's like the alchemy of it, and just watching this transformation happen is incredible and really, really satisfying process to go through. So, in terms of my experience, I went through my brain tanning phase and then I launched into bark tanning. And, I didn't do it as much and as fast as I wanted to, but over time, I've still managed to accumulate a lot of experience and knowledge, and also just reading a lot of really old stuff, like really digging into the older literature and getting whatever I could. And the other thing is, like, over time, as you build your knowledge and you build your understanding, you start to understand which questions to ask, and you start to see in information you can get more out of it. It's more relevant in a context that makes sense. So since the book was published, it was in the mid to late 90s, I think, the brain tanning book, I have been concentrating mostly on bark tan.
Um, can you just, for people who don't know what that is at all, bark tanning and vegetable tanning, will you define what that is?
Yeah, a more appropriate, more traditional term is vegetable tanning, and that is not carrots and beets. It's just an archaic term for plants. Animal, vegetable, mineral, basically. So that's just a more traditional way to refer to anything having to do with plants, the vegetable kingdom. And so it just means tanning with plants, but tan also typically refers to the actual process of tanning with tannic acids versus other methods, because there's also preparing skins with alum, there's tanning, brain tanning and tanning with smoke, and then there's oil tanning, which is also really interesting traditional leather and topic, but we'll just skip over that.
Yeah, it's like another whole hour in itself.
Yeah, and I'm not really well versed in that, but I have a friend who's really good at it. It's just a fascinating process. Since no one understands vegetable tanning, they're like, "What? That sounds weird, right? You're tanning vegetables." And bark is so commonly used, a lot of us refer to it as bark tanning in just common modern language. But you can find tannic acid is all over the plant world. It's in leaves, roots, fruits, seeds, pods, all kinds of stuff, wood. But bark just happens to be a fairly common source that was commonly used because it's available in large quantities and it works really well, and it tends to be high in tannin.
Um, and sometimes it's not actually bark, it could be leaves or like with sumac, for example. So it's
Yeah, some other examples of things would be myrobalan fruits, which is also known as haritaki. It's a really important medicinal in the East, but it also has a high amount of tannin. It's been used for a long time, and that's a global product. Like, that's a product that's been shipped all over the world for tanning. Sandock roots in the Southwest North America. Quebracho wood, which is they'd chip the wood up really fine or even grind it and extract the tannin. Chestnut wood is an example. Sumac leaves are a great example. They're used pretty much anywhere sumac grows. They were used in tanning, and yeah, lots of stuff.
And this process, bark tanning or vegetable tanning, happened and happens all over the world, which is always so fascinating to me too, with like brain tanning and other processes, like how people figured out their own way to do it in the land where they live without knowing these other people in other places doing the same thing. So do you
Yeah,
have any thoughts on that?
yeah, I do. Some of them really, just need to think on a larger scale. And if you think over thousands of years of people, say, using hides as containers, so you may pound up some bark for some other reason, and then you leave it on your hide and you forget it in the rain or spill some water on it. And then, it's just, when you think of it that way, it's almost hard not to discover some of this stuff. The same with brains, like hides are commonly used to carry animal parts after the hunt. So, it's pretty easy to see how that could happen over time. But different cultures have developed more along, certain lines. And part of that is for good reasons. Like brain tanning can be done in a pretty short period of time. It doesn't require a lot of stuff, whereas a lot of vegetable tanning will take a little bit longer. So it's more suited to a little bit more sedentary people.
Mm.
And, we don't really know the full history of tanning, but you run into accounts that indicate, there was definitely brain tanning going on in at least Africa and Japan, I know of for sure. And there's just, for instance, oil tanning was done with shark liver oil on the northwest coast of North America. And the other thing is we tend to think, especially in Western thought, we tend to think of technical things and everything in these sort of discrete packages. Whereas the truth is that people were kind of mixing and matching all these things. So you can't always just say, oh, they're brain tanners or whatever. They might be brain tanning. And like there's a lot of examples in North America of using tanning, what we would consider tanning materials to quote unquote dye skins, but it really affects them. I mean, it does partially tan them and change them. So, for instance, if I want to make some moccasins out of brain tan, I'm probably going to make a really strong bark solution and just throw that hide in and kind of shock it and over tan it and lock it down with the tannins before, and that'll keep it from stretching as much and just make it a little bit more, have more body, less stretch.
Mm-hmm. So, how do you start the process of bark tanning?
Well, I'll just run through a typical process. And again, there's just so many ways to approach this. And when you start looking at the really old literature, you just realize how much variation there was and how different tanneries developed their own method and it just worked. And then they would just sort of stick with it and do that. Well, another tannery might be tanning a similar product, but just do it in a really different way and faster or slower. So let's just take like a deer hide because that's a common thing, and say I want to bark tan a deer hide. Typically, I use lime because I also burn lime, and so I know how to make it, and I can make it myself, and it regulates itself in terms of its own strength, so you can't really cook the skin in it. So I will either flush the hide first, or sometimes not even, put it in a lime solution, which is lime is basically burned limestone or shells. So you burn the limestone or shells, drive off the carbon, add some water, it makes calcium hydroxide, and that's lime. And then you put the skin in there. That is highly alkali and it starts to attack the proteins in the skin. And it will attack the stuff that we want, which is the dermis. That's the core of the skin, and that's what we want to turn into leather. But it attacks it very slowly. And it attacks keratin really fast. Keratin is hair, and the whole layer of skin, like right on the top, like right underneath the hair, there's a very, very thin layer of skin. It might even be only like 1 or 2 cells deep, but that holds the hair in, and that's like part of the whole hair process. And that's really good at protecting us from chemical attack. Like it's not prone to, say, tannin, right? So if that wasn't there and you got tannins on your skin would turn dark. But this is protecting it. But the one thing it's not good at is these strong alkalis. So those attack it and they remove it, and then the hair falls out. So that's mostly to get rid of the hair, but it does also strip out other stuff inside the skin. It dissolves fats and turns them into soap so they can be washed out. It attacks, over time, it can start to attack like the little muscles that cause your hairs to stand on end. And if you can destroy those or break them up and some other things in there, the grain will lay down flat and become mellow. Like in front of us here, we have some different skins, and you can see that some of them are, if you tan a goat skin really fast through the process, it'll be what's called pebbly, or it's like goose pimples, like goose flesh, where it's real bumpy on the surface, and really it's kind of a neat, interesting texture. But if you want the skin to lay flat and have a smooth grain, you have to, you know, treat it so that that stuff gets broken down.
Mm-hmm. Some people use wood ashes at this stage, and you are kind of not into that. And why is that?
I think wood ashes are great. It's just that, and I wouldn't discourage anyone from experimenting with them. I might discourage them from starting with wood ashes because they're less reliable. You know, sometimes they won't be strong enough and they won't do the work, and sometimes they'll be too strong and you'll cook your hide. They're also messier. And yeah, I wouldn't discourage anyone from experimenting. I think it's great. If someone could use just wood ashes and get to know like their species of wood and how to make it work, that's great. But there's just a lot of variables with wood ash. There's different, you know, each tree is going to be different, or region, each species. And then there's like, is the ash fresh or not? And it contains potassium hydroxide, calcium hydroxide, and sodium hydroxide, which all have different strengths. And who knows what all the interplay between all that is. But many people have found that ashes are just hard to control. And I'm sure that's less true if you're in an area and use the same woods all the time and, you know, get to know all that. But yeah, wood ashes are used the same way. They actually contain a lot of lime, like 20 to 30% usually, and other stuff. So once the hair is falling out easily, you throw it on a beam, push the hair out. You don't really scrape it out. You almost drag it out. In fact, for tanners out there, when you're dehairing hides, don't approach them the way you would fleshing or graining a buckskin or something, but flip the tool around and push it the other way so that you're
side.
dragging the hair out of the skin versus kind of scraping it out.
I sometimes just use my fingers to push it all off, you know.
Yeah, that's fine. It is good to apply some pressure with a tool because you are not, now that the lime has gotten in deep into the skin, it has dissolved a bunch of stuff, and there's literally mineral lime down in there too. So when you scrape over it, you'll see this milky stuff coming out. All kinds of stuff will come out. So that extra pressure is a little bit helpful too. But as far as getting the hair out, just getting it out, yeah, I mean, you can pretty much use your hand if the hide is well limed. So after you get the hair out with these alkalis, you need to.
And you're not trying to scrape the. You want to. You're being careful not to damage the grain or the epidermis layer too in this process, because you want to keep that intact versus brain tanning where you're taking that off.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. In fact, you want a really dull tool. Like you can use a piece of wood. I mean, you want your scraper much sharper for flushing, for instance, than you want it for that. So a good alternative is, yeah, literally just get a piece of wood or the back of a knife or something like that, or the back of a machete, and you can use that to just pull the hair out. But you want to apply that pressure to get all that stuff out. So the alkalis have dissolved all the stuff in the skin. There's dissolved fats or fats that have been turned into soap with the alkali. Just like making soap, what do you make soap out of? You make it out of lye and fat, right? And you want to squeegee all that stuff out, basically. So that's called scudding. And that process should go on until the liquids coming out of the hide are mostly clear, like pretty clear. And the alkalis also swell the hide up. It becomes really thick, like 3, maybe even 4 times thick sometimes, and that expands the hide, and it has this rubbery feel.
Kind of blue looking too, right?
Yeah, kind of weird, translucent looking, rubbery thing, and you want that to fall back. It's called fallen or falling, and you want it to fall back to this flaccid state where it like swishes around in the water and drapes over your hand. It's pretty obvious, you know, that you've reached that point. So between that and tanning, there are other things you can do. Like I usually use a solution of hen manure and water. It's just like a ferment. It sounds much worse than it is. It's really not that bad. It's just like a couple, maybe a double handful or two of hen manure, fermented in the sun for a couple of days, and you put the hide in there for a while. That could be anywhere from like a few hours to overnight.
And this is to get the pH back to the flaccid state, the neutral state that you're talking about.
That may do some of that, but that is mostly for conditioning the skin. It mellows the grain. It basically probably attacks the skin, and it's, you know, bacteria and enzymes, or it's enzymes produced by bacteria that are living in the solution, and they will help with things like mellow grain. One of the tests you do when you're baiting, that's called baiting, BATING, is you pick up the hide and you press it with your thumb. And when you first get it out, or when you first put it in there, you can do that, and it'll kind of spring back, or it'll maybe leave a little dent. But later in the process, when you push it, you'll see your actual thumbprint with the lines and everything in the skin. And then if you leave it too far, it just eats the skin up and ruins it. So this is an alternative step. You don't have to do it, but it's usually used to affect the skin and change it. So there's an old saying that leather is made in the beam house, and what that means is that all the processes that you do on the beam and preparing the skin to put in the liquor are the most important parts of the finished character of the leather. And after that, you have less influence, through that process. The other thing I do a lot is called drenching, and drenching is soaking the hide in a solution of fermenting carbohydrate. So usually it's bran, but it can be, you'll read a lot of old recipes will say to use flour, for instance. Some will use sour milk, probably the same thing. It's lactic acid. So I'll say take a couple handfuls of bran, throw them in a bucket, let it start to ferment, which is usually pretty quick, and then you put the hide in. It's like in this fizzy solution. So that removes the last traces of lime that you couldn't wash out, which you really can't wash all of it out, and it just kind of cleans the skin. It's really nice. It's like this acid drench. So then it's ready to go in the bark, and that can be done, usually one of two basic ways. You make a solution and you swish the hide around in solutions and let it sit in there until it's finished, or you take a layer of bark, put down a layer of hide, layer of bark, layer of hide, layer of bark, and this is like shredded bark. I usually use a hatchet to chop it up, and then you cover that with water or bark solution, and then you just let it sit there and do its thing. And after a while, you take that out, and if it needs more, you do it again with fresh bark, and that's usually would be called pit tanning.
Mm-hmm.
And both of those are viable for home tanners, but I would suggest starting in a solution. And then once the skin is penetrated all the way through, it's done enough.
Well, so what is the solution made of, and how is it made, and like, is it a cold solution or a hot solution? Or...
Okay, most materials will extract better with hot water. Some extract easier, some don't. Some need to be literally almost powdered. I mean, they're really ground super fine, and other ones you can pretty much throw in whole and just cook them. And you can do cold extractions if you don't have heat, if you don't have large pots. You can do cold extractions. It just takes longer. And normally, hot or cold, you're doing multiple extractions to get the most out. So at least two. I'll typically do two, but sometimes I'll do three.
Of the same material.
Of the same material. So pour off the first, like cook it for a few hours, maybe pour that off, add more water, cook that, pour that off, and maybe do it a third time. And the temperature, some tannins are apparently destroyed by high heat. So I think you're safe at 120 or lower. So you could think of that as a place to just kind of hold it. Just bring it up to heat and just let it sit there, and you're always safe. Also, cooking at lower temperatures will typically, at least in some cases, and I pretty much confirmed this with tan oak, I think, is the color will be a little bit lighter if you don't boil it too hard.
Oh, interesting. Cool. And tan oak here on your land here is predominantly what's available and what you use. And then is that Notholithocarpus is the genus?
I think it's Nolithocarpus or Notholith.
Something like that.
It used to be just Lithocarpus. What was wrong with that? I don't know.
I think it's okay. So tan oak.
I'm of the opinion that
It's like,
changing names is basically job security for botanists and something to do with their degree.
Something about it being different enough from all the other species that grow. Is it Japan or China or something?
Right, the stone oak in Japan.
Yeah. That it's in California. And
I'm sure they think it's a
unique
good
tree.
reason, but for me it's just confusing.
Either way, it's an awesome tree that's like, it kind of reminds me slightly of chestnut and slightly of oak, and it's maybe somewhere in between that,
Yeah, the flowers smell like chestnut, the leaves look like chestnut, but it's evergreen. It's supposedly not a true oak, but it definitely looks like acorns to me.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. And ours are all dying, unfortunately. Like the one I'm looking at out the window right there is infected. These are huge pyramid-shaped trees. They are the tree that produces acorns almost every year for the wildlife around here. They're really a cornerstone mast producer for wildlife food, and they're all headed out. Like I,
Sudden oak death, right?
yeah, in 5 years, I doubt I'll have 5%, 5 or 10% of our tan oaks will be left. If I could pull it off, I would build a big shed and just stockpile as much as I can. My neighbors have a whole grove of huge trees, easy to drop, tons and tons of bark, the best quality bark, the old thick bark. It'll be like 2 inches thick,
Wow.
super rich. Like you cut it and almost bleeds like this red sap.
And out
But
east, the chestnut blight took out the chestnuts, which was a huge source of tannin, and then the hemlocks got hit with the woolly adelgid.
yeah,
So
what's
it's like,
interesting about the chestnuts is those logs, the dead logs were mined for decades to get tanning material because apparently it doesn't wash out or something. They would
well,
take it, grind it up, and extract the tannins and use it.
you still see the logs in the forest because
Yeah,
they don't rot very fast.
yeah.
It's crazy, but
So we've made our tanning solution and we put the hide in, however you're going to do that, and it eventually penetrates all the way through. So that doesn't necessarily mean it's tanned as much as it could be. And the other thing for any home tanners out there that are experimenting is that color and tanning power are not synonymous. So a mistake, for instance, a lot of people make is that they put a skin in and they're like, oh, this is a preservative solution, and they think it takes a long time because you hear that a lot, and leave it in there, and they're like, there's still color. There's like still some color. It looks like tea or something, but the tannins have been used up. Like the tannins are used up really, really fast in the beginning. If you put a hide in the average solution in 2 days, there's very little left. So you're no longer preserving the hide, and there's no longer anything to tan the skin. Or some of that coloring matter might be slowly penetrating, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the hide is well tanned. So for leathers, especially like sole leather, where they really want to fill the skin as much as possible to make it more of a compound material and more like wood, then you want to put that in extra long and leave it. So they might like put it in an extra layer of bark and just leave it for a long time. Some of these processes could take like 2 years, which was a big problem again financially for like say starting a tannery. You may not see any profits for 2 years, so you need to have backing, and it's a long process. I've even read of liming processes that take a full year, going from say like the weakest pit that's basically used up and spent completely, and they're probably only putting it in there to condition the hide and do certain things to make like the leather have a certain feel, and then they kind of move it from pit to pit, and each month they dump the oldest pit, and the next pit becomes the oldest pit, and they just add a pit like every month.
well. And so with the tannin, putting the hide in the liquor, which is what we're calling the tannic fluid that the hide is sitting in, how many different rounds? Because for me, I've done it before where I've done so many rounds, I don't even know if it was totally necessary, of like fresh, strongly made brew. Like it sucks up all the tannins, the water turns a lot clearer, not totally, but then it's like taken up as much tannin as it can, and then you put it in a new solution of strong liquor again, right?
Well, a strategy for that works good. First of all, the way I judge liquor strength is I just put my hand in the liquor and I look at it under the liquor to see how dense the liquor is and if I can see my hand, or I pick it up and I look at it in my palm like a little puddle to see how clear it looks, because that gives you kind of a gauge. You can see something through the liquor. And again, it's not going to ever become perfectly clear. So when it just becomes really weak and it starts to look like a cup of tea or something, you're out of stuff, that's not doing anything anymore. So, that question is just too hard to answer because there's so many variables.
Depends on the hide.
Every hide is different. It's going to require more tannin. How much tannin was in the stuff? How much material did you use? How fine did you chop it? Where was it growing? Was it growing in the sun? Was it growing in the shade? Was it from the top of the tree or the bottom of the tree? Did it sit out and get rained on? There's just infinite number of variables. So I tend to use my eyes for that, and looking at the liquor. So every time you get into the liquor, first thing before you put the hide in or anything, get it ready, pick it up in your hand and look at it. And then within the first day, I'm usually adding liquor. It's that fast. Certainly by the second day, I don't want it to go more than 2 days in the beginning without me adding something. But a good way to start is to take the second cook or even the third cook.
Do that first.
Yeah, and start in that. And then I will start dumping in the first cook in batches. So I'll just dump in, a few quarts of that or something at first. And when you start to get too much liquor, that becomes a problem, right? Because it's just getting more and more diluted. So I'll leave it in for a few days, try to get it to soak up as much in there as possible so there's not much left. Dump most of that liquor out and then add a bunch of concentrate. So that's a pretty good strategy to use.
Can you comment on something called case hardening? That would be something to be thinking about at this
Yeah.
stage.
The fear of case hardening has actually ruined like innumerable hides, is what I think. Everyone's terrified of it. It's like that thing. There's this phenomenon I've seen. It's like a pattern. It happens a lot in gardening where people find out about something and then they're just terrified. Like if you pee on your plants, they're gonna die. And you have to dilute it like 10 times. If you put coffee grounds on your plants, it's the acid. If you put wood chips on the ground, it's going to take all the nitrogen and everything's going to die. It's like this fear-based mentality. Well, in tanning, case hardening is that thing. And what happens is because people are so terrified of case hardening, they start really, really weak and they don't understand that just how much tannin you need, and it's quite a bit. And also that if there isn't a lot of tannin in the solution, the skin is not preserved. Basically,
it's rotting.
It's
actively.
essentially rotting. Yeah, it might not be quite the same as like just soaking in water. It's not at all, right. But it's definitely undergoing negative changes in there, and you can end up with like dark brittle leather when it comes out. So case hardening is real, for sure. But I can't think of a material. My guess, my experience is somewhat limited because I'm spoiled. I live in California. I probably have 6 or 7 oaks within 10 miles, oak species. And I have tons and tons of oak on my property. I can just get it wherever, so I tend to just use that. And there are apparently certain materials, because they contain different types of tannin, are more prone to case hardening. But I can't imagine a second cook ever damaging a hide. Like you should be safe with starting with second cooks. Mm-hmm. And if you're really worried about it, or if you ever see any problems, just start with the third cook or add a little bit extra water.
So case hardening makes a hide tan too fast, and it creates like what is it exactly?
Case hardening is just that. It's just too strong. If you put something really tannic in your mouth, it's puckery, right? Mm-hmm. You can feel it kind of seizing up your skin and making it shrink. Like if you put it on your tongue, you get this. An unripe persimmon is the classic example, extreme example. So you get this whole puckery thing, and your mouth feels really dry. Well, it basically does that to the hide if it's too strong, and it shrinks it super fast, and it locks down the outside of the skin, thus case hardening, and forms a layer that's so tight that the liquor can't penetrate into the skin. And that is a problem. You need to keep the tanning kind of progressing, and if it doesn't, or if you have super hot weather, the skin inside that core that's untanned can rot because the tanning happens from the outside in. So it's very slowly penetrating through, and in some cases that could take 6 months or a year depending on the circumstances. So yeah, that's what case hardening is. It just kind of seizes the skin up on the outside. And if it's reversible, it takes time, and you just don't want to do it in the first place. But for most home tanners, it's not going to be a huge deal. It's not like you have to use something that looks like your grandma's tea to start the hide in. Do it. I think the cook thing is perfect because almost everyone's doing either a cold extraction that's liquid and starting in that, or they're cooking it and starting in that, but just use that second extraction to get started with.
And also something I was just reminded of is that the vessel that you're putting the liquor in, it has to be a specific size too for the best tanning. So what's that about?
Vessel size is important. You don't want something that's too huge because then you have to, let's say you have a deer hide and you throw it in a kiddie pool. You have all this extra room around the edges because the pool's round, and you want the thing covered, so then you have to fill the pool 3 or 4 inches, which just turns into a huge amount of water. And even then it's going to be hard to keep it submerged all the time. So you're better off with, say, something the size of a 20-gallon tub or something like that. And if you were to take the relatively large skin, like say a large deer or something, and just stuff it into a 5-gallon bucket, basically it's going to be crushed in there. So everywhere it's touching itself and everywhere it's touching the side of the bucket, it has a reduced access to liquor, whether it's liming or tanning or whatever. And that's okay if you go long enough or you keep moving it or if you move it constantly. Like those are okay, but it's not ideal. So just having it big enough that it can swim around in there a little bit, but not so big that you need all this extra liquor, because it's just, yeah, that doesn't work out too good. And for layering, layering will work in tubs. You can throw in a layer of bark, lay the skin, like say a deer skin, lay the neck in maybe, throw some bark on top of that, and then fold the skin, and then layer bark, and then fold it again, kind of like an accordion or something like that. As long as every bit of the skin is touching shredded bark.
And how much do you break apart the bark before you use it? I know some people are really into like getting it as almost as powdered as possible, and other people are a little more lazy about that and just like use whole chunks and are like whatever. But
Yeah, if you use really large chunks, you're probably not going to get as much out. But I think there's a sweet spot and a point of diminishing returns when you're a home tanner doing stuff by hand. So for me, when I first started, I tried using like a plane and like planing the stuff off. It's horribly slow, way too slow to do many whole hides, even like the size of goats, deer, and sheep. So then I just went to a hatchet and I just try to cut across the grain a little bit and just try to make the shavings thin. So they're like 1/8 is what I shoot for. Maybe they're a quarter, some of them, maybe they're a little bit less. In traditional pit tanning, they actually use different sizes of bark for the different phases. So if you're doing a cattle skin, it's going to be in there three to four different layers for two, probably 1 to 3 months each, even 4 months each, maybe. So they would choose different sizes of bark. And this is just something I read. And I don't even remember which there was, like they used the smaller bark in the beginning or the end. But yeah, they actually tailored that. So as home tanners, that's like beyond anything we really need to worry about. I just say watch out for that point of diminishing returns where you're adding a bunch of work, but you're probably not getting that much out. And again, like this is it, context is king, right? So what material you're using and how easy is it to get. For me, I have a half cord of bark already stacked up in my woodshed, so I kind of need to use it up. I don't really care if I get every scrap of tannin out of it or not. So there's a lot of variables. And then, of course, some materials extract really easy, like oak galls. I can just like hit them with a rock, throw them in there, and I'm going to get most of the stuff out without any extra work. While other materials like woods, for instance, carbracho, I think they actually grind it into almost a powder to get the most out of it.
And if you're using something like sumac leaves, you're not.
Yeah,
Honestly.
often that was powdered too, but again, they had a machine probably to do that, and for us, it's yeah, just probably crush it up. I don't know. Maybe we're throwing it in a blender. I don't know. There's probably actually science on that, on what it takes to get tannin out of sumac. I would guess.
Like the most efficient way.
Yeah, to get the most out, because that's when the leather chemists came in. Again, most of them weren't tanners. They just whatever. How do you decide a career in leather chemistry when you're not a tanner? I don't know, but they did. And they were all about looking at this from the outside and looking at it like, oh, you know, we can improve this. Everything could be improved, right? There was the golden age, and science was going to save everyone from everything. Still is, apparently. And so they're like, yeah, we can make this more efficient. We can make you more money. That's, you know, your business, right? Like, let's make more money. And so they went through like, okay, well, we're going to extract this way, and we're going to do it this many times at this temperature, and we're going to get every scrap of tannin out of this bark, so we don't waste it. Which in many ways is good, because they were wasting a lot. When you pit tan, you're wasting a lot of tannin. And they were just like, no, you can't do this anymore, and we can do it in like 1/10 the time.
The scudding that you were mentioning earlier, do you do that after every new bath of liquor? I've heard some people are like, yeah, scud it. I mean, I guess, like you've been saying, we've been talking about this the past few days, like, depends on what you want out of it, too, right?
Yeah. During the deliming process, when you're trying to get the lime out, you really need to scud a lot. As a home tanner, I haven't found anything else that works. I tried a washing machine. I haven't really had access to a really good creek that moved a lot for a long period of time.
I've
But
been
it
spoiled
typically
by
with
that.
lime is just hard to get out of the skin, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So I haven't found any substitute for scudding a lot. So typically I'll go scud maybe 5 to 7 times ish, average, just to get the hide fallen. But that's kind of good because again, you're it's not just falling, making the hide fall again. You're getting all this stuff out, and you'll see it come out every time you scud, and eventually it'll just start to come out clear. With the tanning part, scudding is not really necessary at all, but it will make it go a lot faster. So again, tannin is astringent and it shrinks things. So it'll pull the hide in and shrink it up, and then that means that liquor can pass less easily through it, kind of like case hardening. So it really speeds things up to throw the hide on the beam and just scrape over the flesh side and kind of stretch it back out. Plus, you're taking the old liquor out, which is kind of used up, and then when you put it back in the fresh solution, it gets, a hit right away of
Just like
strong
a
solution.
sponge, you let pour out all the extra, and then it can
Right.
soak up more.
Yeah, so if I'm trying to get a bark tan class done in like 5 days, maybe 5 to 6 days at an event, the hides are limed when they get there. We scud just hourly, with fresh water to get the hides ready to tan. They go in there. I make the students come by all day, just whenever they can, and stretch the hides in the solution and then take them out on the beam several times a day, scud over the flesh side, and they're tanned in a few days that way. Whereas if you just throw the thing in and leave it, then that will not be true. But it's okay too, and that's kind of nice because you can procrastinate, which you can't do as much with brain tanning, but that becomes a real trap, and that has also ruined countless hides. Just saying, oh, just having that mental thing like, oh, this is preservative, I'll just put it off for another week and another month, and then a year later people dig the stuff out and like, I don't know why my hides got this thing.
I know that's
Because
only
you
so
soaked it
far
in
you can push
grandma's
it.
tea for
Right.
a year basically.
Well, like once you get past that first stage too, where the bacteria is alive, more, and you get it at least halfway done, you can be a little more like, okay, slow it down. At least in my experience, in the beginning, you can't really just be as lazy with it with bartending. Right?
Absolutely, yeah, that's true. That's exactly how it goes. So what I will do is right away, usually in the first day, I'm dumping concentrate in there. Certainly by the second day, if I'm just get busy or something, it's okay to go like another day, but I want to start strengthening that right away. And yeah, you'll hit a point where you'll just see it disappear in almost in hours, like the solution just gets weak, but then that stops happening, and then you can leave it that little bit longer, maybe dump some of the weak stuff out, and then get it into a really strong solution. And once it starts to tan and you get past that initial phase, you can use a much stronger liquor, and that will preserve the hide for long periods of time. Then you could maybe leave it for a month or two even. It
Ever
just, again, that's real contextual though. You have to pay attention to what's going on with the skin.
do you ever reuse that liquor that is not clear, but the grandma's tea liquor, like the spent liquor to reboil with? Like some
You
people are
could,
like,
but again, context, if it's that important to you to get that little scrap of tannin, but it ain't much. It's like enough to dye the skin a little bit or something.
I mean, like reuse the water to reboil more tannin and
Yeah, again, you could, but there's not much left.
right.
So do you want to smell that in your kitchen? It's fine if you want. Now, what was done a lot was reusing old lime liquors and tan liquors for other reasons. So again, with like I said, with the lime, they'd start in a totally spent solution that really wasn't doing much of anything anymore. Maybe same with the tan, they do that. Also, I've heard of dehairing in old tan liquors and using them to acidify and almost like a baiting process where there's all this dissolved proteins in there, and there's enzymes and bacteria and stuff, and they do certain things to the hide that affect the quality and character of the hide later, and that was often desirable. And so you would keep these pits, several pits, and one was always kind of spent. You start a batch of hides in there, move it to the next one, and then when you have a new batch of hides, you throw that liquor out, and the next oldest one becomes the spent one, and you just kind of cycle them through like that. So that just worked into the mechanics of the tannery and the process. So for home tanners, that's fascinating, and this is where we get into the art of tanning. Like the point that we're at, like that I'm at, and every other bark tanner I know is just so rudimentary. This is just we're just at these basic processes and kind of rediscovering the basics. And you can read about all this stuff, but you can't just go and apply it like you suddenly know it, right? This is the art of tanning, and that's what we need to eventually rediscover. It's like right now we're laying groundwork for rediscovering the art of tanning, and that's how it was. These people were artists. They were industrial artists or artisans, and they had these things that worked, and they knew how to do things by feel. It was like there was a guy, and his job was to watch the hides and the bait, right? Or especially there's one called puring. Puring. I don't know how to pronounce it. Maybe it's puer, but this is using dog dung. I've even heard of using human dung, but dog dung like fermented in a vat, right? And it will destroy the skin really fast. It has this profound effect on the skin. It's like the best soft draping leathers, for ladies' gloves that were all like fermented in dog dung. So there's a dude, and his job is to know that process. Like how I'm sure he was like smelling it. Let's hope he wasn't tasting it. He's watching it. He knows how many times it's been used and what temperature it's at. And of course, this probably wasn't measured, right? And this guy is like, this is what he does, and he watches those skins, and it's like right now, you get them out of there and rinse them right away, or they're going to be ruined. Like they're at this perfect stage. We're way far away from that. So for home tanners, this whole thing about putting hides into spent liquors and having these stages and saving liquors to reuse is fascinating. But if you're not doing stuff in batches in a timeline, that's really difficult, because I might tan a batch of hides and I'll be like, oh yeah, I want to start in that later. And then suddenly it's 6 months later and I open it. It's like, I'm going to dump that out. It smells terrible. Same with lime liquors. So that's a fascinating area to explore later. But again,
the nuances of all these
yeah,
things.
at this point for home tanners, a lot of that stuff, just stick with the basics until you're producing something reasonably consistent.
Mm-hmm. And also, the other day you were showing me, we have a bunch of hides in front of us here on the bed. Like how different each hide can turn out depending on how you're doing the bucking process and the tanning process too. Like it can be really fluffy and soft, or thick and heavy. And I know that the softening, which we haven't gotten to, is a part of that as well. But yeah, and of course it's the type of animal and like all kinds of things. But
Right. So after the skin comes out, you can do various things with it, and you can say, well, I want this to be extra soft because I'm going to make a jacket out of it, or pants or something like that, right? So you can take the hide and use different oils and different processes and work it more or work it less to make it try to come out the way that you want it. You may even, instead of fluffing it up and softening it, you might want to compress it, and that can go anywhere from just drying it really flat and using a heavy oil that's solid at room temperature, like tallow, like beef tallow or goat or sheep or deer. Or you can even go so far as to compress it. So they had these giant bronze rollers that are just super, super heavy. They'd put them on this flat floor and then pull this giant roller across it, like a steam roller, basically, to compress the leather for, say, shoe soles. The other way they would do that is they'd have the hide on some kind of an anvil, and there would be dudes with big hammers pounding on it, like at a blacksmith's anvil, and they would just pound the whole thing to like compress it. So that's all good and well, but again, the leather is made in the beam house. So there's two more major factors that go into that, and one in between. So the first one is, what kind of skin is it? So you can take a deer skin and bark tan it and try to steer it from the very beginning in a direction to make kind of like a solid heavy leather. Maybe you want to make sheaths out of it or something like that. But there's only so much you can do, because deer hide has relatively large and coarse fibers. The same is true, but more so, of buffalo. Very, very fibrous, open structure. Not very many fibers, very large fibers, and just knit together in a felt-like thing. So this piece of leather here that I'm looking at, maybe you can take a picture and put it up there. Parts of this are probably a 1/2 inch thick here.
Yeah, it's huge.
This is an elk neck, but it feels like a piece of felt. It's not even that heavy for its size. If you kind of look at it, you expect it to be a little bit heavier. I made a pair of sandals out of this, and they wore out super fast because it's just got this coarse, open texture. Same is true of all of our large wild North American hides. Moose, elk, buffalo all have this kind of basic characteristic to some degree. Whereas a cattle hide, here's a cattle hide here,
which is thinner, slightly thinner, but super dense.
Yeah, so this is thinner, but it just feels dense and heavy. And this isn't compressed. This is just pasted out to a board and dried. And you can hear it almost sounds like a piece of wood. And it is almost woody. And if you were to compress it more and treat it in certain ways from the beginning, you can make it even more so. And this is what you would use for maybe like shoe soles or something like that. So a major factor to start with is just the hide, and a contrast to deer skin would be goat skin. So goat skin has a much finer fiber structure. It's more densely compacted. The whole skin is thinner, but say I'm looking at this goat skin here, it has a thin kind of flattish feel to it. It doesn't drape, and I kind of made it that way on purpose, but a lot of it has to do with the fact that it's a goat. This deer skin that I have in my hand is drapey. You know, it drapes, and again, part of that is that I steered it that way, but it just wants to be that way. You know, it wants to be this kind of softer, looser leather.
And then you have a pigskin in there too.
Right. Pigskin's another great example. So pigskin just doesn't really stretch. It's like this hard, unstretchy material. They use it for the bottoms of saddles because it doesn't stretch, and so it's not going to like make folds underneath there and irritate the horse. And yeah. So that's one factor. And then the other one is, what do you do to it? Right? Are you going to take it and soak it in all these old lime solutions that have bacteria and enzymes, and they're like working on the skin, they're breaking down these little muscles and stuff in the skin that cause the goose pimple effect, and so the grain will lay down smooth? Are you going to after that bait it or put it in, you know, hen's dung or dog dung and recondition it even more to make it more pliable and more mellow and more soft? Or are you going to rush it through that process and say, like, put it in a fresh hot lime, hot but meaning chemically hot, like fresh strong lime solution, get it through that process pretty quick, get it into a fresh tan liquor, just like not an old tan liquor, which again has all this stuff in it that's going to affect it, kind of get it through that process pretty quick, and then dry it quick. You know, these have a lot to do with how that happens. And again, rediscovering that whole part up to the tanning especially, but including, you know, how that hide is tanned, how long it takes, how strong the solutions are, and whether you start with old solutions. But mostly the pre-processes in the beam house is, again, that's like the art of tanning that needs to be dug back into and rediscovered. And then we get to the softening or the compressing or all of that stuff. But by that time, a lot of that's already decided. And that's an important thing to remember, is that if that skin doesn't want to be that thing, don't try to make it that thing. Just go back and start over.
How do you know when a hide's done?
Well, again, with the done, just because it is penetrated all the way through, even with tannin, even if it's not just like dye color, then it can probably still take up more tannin. So with, say, shoe sole leather, they would just leave it an extra, maybe even put it in an extra layer and leave it for another 3 to 4 months just to take up as much as possible. So if you want your hides to be well tanned, don't really think of just, oh, as soon as it's penetrated with color, it's done. Because in some cases, it's literally not even really tanned. It's just some kind of dye stuff that has managed to get through there in the year that you left it soaking in this stuff, whatever the stuff is. And again, color is not synonymous with tanning power or even with tannin.
Right, because I was talking to you about my coffee and tea experiments, and those are tricky because they have some tannin, but they're also dyes. So.
Yeah, they may have coloring agents that are not tannin. I'm not really sure, but you know, I would kind of assume so.
People say to cut a piece and look in there, and if it's penetrated all the way, it's done. But you're saying that that's
typically
not always the only thing to look at.
Yeah, that's typically true, but it doesn't hurt to leave it a little bit longer. As long as the solution is strong, you're going to get that extra little bit. And it just kind of depends on what it's soaking into. Like if your solution is really strong and you take it out and you haven't looked at it for weeks and it's penetrated all the way through at the neck, you know, it's probably good then. But yeah, that's the main criteria that you use, is cutting a thick part of the skin, maybe like a 1/2 inch in. You have to go in a little bit and see if there's a white line in there or if it's dark all the way through.
And will the liquor that the hide is in, will it stop? Like, will the tannin still be kind of floating around in the liquor? Like, you're like, okay, it's not taking any more in. It's kind of like got as much inside of it as it can get.
Yeah, and you want that. I mean, you want that because that's kind of preserving the whole solution. So
Right.
when you're finished with a solution, you're going to have more tanning power left in that liquor for
Right.
sure. And if you can, you should put that to use.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I often end up throwing it out just because the timing doesn't work out.
Totally. So after you've determined that it's done, what's the softening process like?
Well, you don't always go through a softening process. Some typical ways to finish would be if you want to make, say, sheaths or shoes, definitely shoe soles. You want to just kind of dry the hide flat. Typically, you're going to use heavier oils. A common thing is to mix tallow, which is just basically fat that's solid at room temperature. This is beef, sheep, goat, deer are excellent examples. Mix that with 50% of a liquid oil, like a oil that's liquid at room temperature. I usually use olive oil, but neatsfoot oil is pretty traditional. Neatsfoot oil is the oil from inside the bones of the foot and lower leg of deer, cows, goats, stuff like that. And that's pretty common. It's called dubbin. It's like this 50-50 mix. But you want to tend to use heavier oils for leathers that you want to have a lot of body and you want it to be stiff. And again, a greatest example for that is sheaths. Like you want your knife sheath or your axe sheath or a gun holster or something like that to have all this body and retain its shape. So then you would take that method I use a lot is I put a bunch of that fat on the flesh side of the skin. I flip it over on a piece of wood, like a big table or a piece of wood like plywood or something. Oil the grain side, which is the hair side, and then take this tool called the slicker, which is basically, usually it's a piece of slate that's just rounded on the edge. It's like real round and really smooth, and it just kind of polishes and lays flat the whole skin. You push on it and it pastes and sticks the hide to the board with that fat, and then you just dry it slow, and that's really it. I mean, that's kind of the finish. So if I wanted to make a skin, let's say extra soft, like I wanted to make a jacket out of it or something, first I'm going to say, does the skin want to do that? You know, if it's a piece of cattle skin that's a 1/4 inch thick, like you might as well, no, not going to happen. So if let's say I have a deer skin, I want to make something like that out of it, I'm going to blend up some eggs, egg yolks, some olive oil in a blender, make a warm solution out of that, and put the hide in there. And this is the same as brain tanning. That's called a fat liquor. And fat liquors are basically emulsions of oil and water. And an emulsion just means that the egg yolk or the brain is soluble both in oil and in water, and it forms a bridge between the two, and it allows the oil to stick to that substance and stick to the water and go into solution. So instead of pouring oil all over your hide and hoping it sort of like migrates its way into the interior of the hide, which it kind of has to do by just this sort of like seeping and creeping effect, you dissolve the oil in water and it carries it straight into the skin. And so this conditions the skin deeply, just like we do with brains and brain tanning, same exact thing. And then I'll add a little oil as I work the skin. So typically I will dry that skin out completely, usually with that solution in it. And then I do something called damping back. So damping back is taking wet towels, like you want to get all the water you can out of it, just wring it and wring it and wring it. So it's as close to damp and not wet as you can get it. Lay the hide on these wet towels, you know, just basically covered in wet towels, roll it up and leave it overnight. And that will pretty evenly redistribute moisture into the skin. And then you can kind of work it as it dries, but you don't have to start with a sopping wet hide, so it's a lot less work. And during that process, I'll typically oil the grain and, you know, maybe the flesh side a little bit. And I have been migrating towards using a tool called a graining board. It's a flat, curved board. It's curved on the bottom side.
Oh, it's in one of your videos when we watched.
Yeah, it's in a couple of those videos, and it basically it has teeth on the bottom and it just grips the hide so you can roll the hide back and forth on a table. It's kind of hard to explain in just words, but I use that. You can just work it in your hands. I like stakes, which is just a post with a dull blade in it, and you can kind of pull the hide over the top of that on the flesh side to soften it. But if anyone's especially coming from a brain tanning background, it's way easier than that. It's actually the hides almost want to be soft. because the tannins, I mean, we didn't really cover that, but the way the tannins work is they go into the skin and they bind with the skin fiber, and they disrupt the way that natural fresh skin interacts with water. So a lot of the reason our skin works on our bodies, that it has this resiliency, and you can poke it with sharp things and it doesn't puncture too easily, and it just has this resilience, is because of the way it behaves with water, and because these proteins have a certain type of interaction with water that makes them work, and without it they don't work. So you dry the skin out and it turns into rawhide, and all these fibers in there are just sticking to each other like glue, which they are. You can actually cook that in water and dissolve it and then use it as glue, and that's what hide glue is. But when you tan, you disrupt all that, and you actually build little chemical bridges between the fibers to keep them separate, to hold them open, and suddenly you put water in the hide, but it doesn't do this whole rubbery swelling thing like a big, sponge thing. It just will not hold as much water, it behaves differently, and when you dry it, it doesn't have this tendency to just lock back down and glue itself together like rawhide.
Where do those glues go? They get
They
rinsed
don't
out in the
go
process.
anywhere. I mean, you, I don't think that it's really like there's loose glue in there. It's more like glue is made of dissolved collagen, but the collagen fibers probably,
Right.
I'm not sure of this, but I think the collagen fibers just probably work in the same way. And they have some kind of attraction to each other where they stick together, and that's what really makes rawhide what it is. And, any kind of aging, like sitting hides around for a year or two, will affect that. So it happens differently
Mm-hmm.
or doesn't happen at all. And so bark tan hides are not particularly hard to soften.
Mm-hmm.
They kind of are already most of the way there.
So if you're using egg yolks, which if you're using like the animal brains, which is part of the brain tan process, it's basically using the same thing.
Yeah.
You don't have to smoke it because the tannins are kind of interacting in a way that makes it so that that's
Correct. So the process is called cross-linking, where you're building these little chemical bridges between the fibers, and disrupting the way they behave with water, and also uh, literally holding the fibers kind of apart and keeping them from gluing back together. And that's exactly what smoke does. Smoke just uses aldehydes, think formaldehyde and other aldehydes in the smoke, tan the hide. And one of the one of the modern tanning processes is aldehyde tanning. So they use formaldehyde and these other aldehydes to pickle the skin. A common aldehyde tannage is pig skin. If you get a thin pig skin, and you can tell it because there's little groups of 3 dots. There'll be these little patterns of three holes. Actually, they're actually holes and little dots all over the skin, and it's really thin and it's kind of a light beigeish color. That's usually aldehyde tanned.
oh.
Yep. That's the one thing that I know of that will make hide glue waterproof is formaldehyde. That's what they used to use for waterproof hide glue.
Wow. And then the leather, it's well. Speaking of waterproof, I was just thinking of that. Like brain tan is not really waterproof because it doesn't have grain, right? And it's really permeable. But I feel like bark tan is pretty. It's not totally waterproof, right? But it's pretty close.
I would say it's really not, but it has
Not
more
really.
potential to be.
More
And
depending on that one
yeah,
material.
and also there's a difference between waterproof and water resistant. Like, is if you wear a cotton shirt, the water's literally going to run through your shirt, right? But with a leather jacket, it's gonna soak the leather, but it's not going to really migrate through the leather that much. It's just going
Mm-hmm.
to be wearing a big wet thing, and then most of it's going to sheet off once it's saturated. But there's certainly more potential to make it waterproof because if you leave the grain on, the shiny part right under the hair, which most vegetable tan leathers do, there's a potential to seal that a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
maybe with a wax or something. But I haven't really given that a good trial, and you know, you're gonna change the character of the leather a lot, and everyone's done that with their boots, probably with snow seal and similar things that contain
Mm-hmm.
waxes. But it only works for a while, and it doesn't really work 100%.
And this cup that's sitting here too that you showed me the other day, and you have a video on how you made it, is made from leather, bark tan leather that you tan, but also you did all these other things to it to basically make it pretty darn waterproof.
Yeah. So that process is basically cooking leather, and that doesn't necessarily make it waterproof. What makes these waterproof is
Is
the pitch lining,
the pitch.
which I took out of this to fix it. But yeah, but that is made that this cup is made with a process where you cook the leather. You don't really boil it. You don't want to boil it. That's too hot. But it goes into water at a certain temperature, and it shrinks the skin fiber. It shocks them and kind of cooks them, and those proteins shrink, and it starts to shrink down. And then when you dry it after doing that, it's quite hard, almost like a wood. And it has to be bark tanned leather to do that, or vegetable tanned leather.
So, why do this?
That's a good question. There's a certain mindset in which this doesn't make sense. But I'm not a Luddite, and most people, even if they think they are, eventually find out that they're not. And yeah, I mean, you can argue that, but at the same time, traditional arts and crafts, especially when they create superior products or natural, harmless products or products that can be incorporated into natural systems, effectively and safely, where you're using natural products and everything that comes out of your process is has a way to either dispose of it without creating any problems, or is actually a benefit, which is the case with most of this stuff. And you produce something that's entirely safe. Like, I would hand any of these leathers to a baby and let it chew on them. Do not do that with commercial leather. Almost every tannery is using some kind of solvents, metals. I mean, who knows what?
And then that stuff's getting rinsed into the environment.
Yeah, and they do it for reasons like it gives them that little bit of edge to get the hide done faster. Like, if you add solvents to your fat liquors or your oils, they just get in that much quicker. It thins them out. The solvent goes in, it evaporates and leaves the oil, and you can smell it. Like, when you go into a tannery, a modern commercial tannery, you can still smell the solvents in the hides. And so, there's something to be said for that. And the other thing is, we have migrated toward this really kind of throwaway mass culture that incurs a lot of waste, and we don't know until we try to reincorporate these things in a sane way, like in a way that really kind of makes sense and is comes from a perspective where you're just trying to do this better and trying not to be wasteful of resources, and not try to fit this idea in this product into the current paradigm. Like, someone, for instance, asked me about a magazine that's basically like a fashion magazine, and they were interested in like sustainability and all this. And I'm like, you got to be kidding. I mean, fashion is the epitome of unsustainability, right? I mean, the kind of fashion that they promote is antithetical, absolutely antithetical to any kind of sustainable approach to using resources. It's all about what's new, what's for sale, how can we sell it, and throw away the thing that's we're done with.
That's old news.
And this especially does not fit into that. I mean, it just doesn't. There's too much resources, too much time.
You could wear a coat made from one of these for 20 years, and it's like, this is this thing.
Right. That's the paradigm in which it makes sense. We're in get the cheapest thing. It wears out early, and then you throw it away. Now, is this kind of like high quality, sustainable, vegetable tanned thing going to apply to like the average person wearing shoes? No, especially in today's world where we have just way too many people to provide resources for. And an interesting story is that, let's say with the tan oak tree that grows here, there was an industry cutting that for tanning for these big tanneries all over California and elsewhere, mostly California. And they started in Big Sur, where there's really high quality stuff. That's the southern limit. Big trees growing in the sun with super thick bark. And they harvested all of that, and then they started moving north through the Santa Cruz Mountains, and just kept going north. They got to Mendocino. This whole area was heavily harvested for bark tanning. This, like, a lot of what people did in the summer for money was peeling bark. They got to Humboldt. I mean, and then people were starting to freak out. They're like, okay, we used most of the hemlock back east. They just slaughtered the forest, dropped the trees. They didn't even use them for anything. It's
Yes,
just
or
cut down.
chestnut was like that too. Like,
Probably, all kinds of stuff was like that. It's just this kind of use the resource mentality we're about later. But they started to freak out because it's like, okay, so people saw it coming, right? They're going to run out. And then chemical tanning came along.
and they're like, oh, phew, we don't have to
Yeah,
worry.
pretty much. And in a way, it kind of was a good thing. I mean, you could see it that way for sure. It's like they were just raping everything to get tannin. And then we're looking at what are we going to do now? Like, are we going to grow this stuff? I mean, they were experimenting with growing it different ways. And so in a way that kind of like saved the trees, but then it created a whole new set of problems to the point where most tanning can't be done in the States now because our environmental laws are too strict. So we ship it to India.
Whoa.
These people are literally getting poisoned at their jobs every day, like waiting around in vats of toxic stuff. Then they just dump it in the rivers, and everyone else is doing our dirty work and taking on that burden of pollution. So they used to, even with bark tanning, just because of carelessness, they used to kill entire streams, that would just be dead because they would just dump everything into the stream, all the chromium, acids, lime, everything, and it just screwed everything up. So
Those
I don't
things
know.
affect like amphibians really strongly too. I mean everything, but
Yeah,
yeah.
they affect all the aquatic life. And so I don't know what the solution is to that, but one part of it is that we have too many people needing to consume resources. And we just don't have, we can't just overnight switch to this type of tanning, even if we could figure out how to make it economically viable, because there aren't enough resources to do it.
You've been talking about an idea for creating like a closed loop system on a homestead that would be like growing tannins like willow or something that you can keep on cutting and it grows again and things like that. So do you have any thoughts about like that idea?
Yeah, without launching into that, because it's like
Like
an
a big
entire
thing.
another interview, um, I have some ideas that I would like to develop and mostly write down in the hopes that someone else will do it someday. Like, I would like to do it here, but I'm not sure that's going to happen in my lifetime. But the basic concept is that if you use a tannery as the center of a model of sustainable industry, you have all these resources coming in one end and leaving out the other end. And we tend to think of anything that comes out of any industry on the back end as waste because it's not part of that industry. But in this case, almost everything is useful in some way. So we're bringing in wood, we're bringing in bark, we're bringing in lime, we're bringing in hides. On those hides, there's hair, there's flesh, the fleshy stuff on there. And then we go through this whole process and we spit out leather, and then there's leftover bark. There's leftover used up lime that's charged with all these nutrients and proteins and stuff. When we bring in the bark, you're also taking that off a tree. So that provides an opportunity to get that wood, maybe bring it in or use it for something. And you have like hair, and you have these effluents like the spent bark liquor. Like, what do you do with that, right? And I just think that there's ways to use all that stuff for related industry or pursuits, like growing mushrooms is one.
Mm-hmm.
Spent bark used to be highly valued for heating greenhouses, and the accounts I have indicate that it's better than manure. It's a mellower, longer heat. Like, if you dig a 3-foot trench and fill it with this stuff in your greenhouse, it'll last for 3 to 6 months, and then if you stir it up, it'll last for another few months. You could turn that stuff into biochar. When you turn it into biochar, along with all that wood, you can make electricity while you're doing that and sell it to the grid. You can then sell that biochar, or you can use it on agricultural land to raise more animals, or raise more tanning materials, or you could have a farm associated with it that takes your other stuff like lime. In an area like mine where there's acidic soil, lime is a very valuable fertilizer. I mean, people buy this stuff. Not only that, if I have lime that comes out of my tanning process, it's charged with all these minerals and proteins and stuff like that. So that's the gist of it. Is I think that aside from the human factor, and organizing people and making all that happen, and either doing all that stuff yourself or having links between all these different groups of people and industries that have relationships to each other. Like, say, you provide fertilizer for the guy that raises cows, and he, provides you with hides, stuff like that. It just seems technically, theoretically, all that is very possible.
It may be necessary in some ways.
It just makes
Really.
sense. I mean, if you look at it, if you design that and look at it, and you can just look at it and say, well, it's stupid not to do that. Like, these are not waste products, and they're kind of a problem. If you treat them that way, they're a problem. Like, where do you put all these piles and piles of bark? What do you do with fleshings, right? They're super gross. They're going to rot. Well, how about, you could raise, my friend was really into these soldier fly larvae. So they're these big black flies, and they eat really gross stuff. So you could have these kind of nesting things for them. They go in there, their grubs eat all this stuff. They crawl out of this little chute and fall in a bucket. You feed those to your chickens, or you can even sell them to people that raise pets. Like, people will actually buy these things. Even you can dry them and sell them and stuff. And then when they're done with it, it's much less gross. It's already mostly broken down. You could put it into, say, a compost pile, and you could sell that compost. There's all kinds of things you can do, but you just have to put the stuff where it does the most good, and most of it is actually really valuable. Like, maybe you look at the tan liquor, right? It's still got some acidity. It's fermented. It's got acidity. It's got some tannin. Blueberries, right? Blueberries like acidic soil.
Right.
Probably could irrigate them with just that, I would
I
guess.
never thought of that.
But no one will know until we try it.
Until you try it. Yeah.
And you may also be able to take that and neutralize it with the lime liquor. And there's all kinds of possibility there for agriculture. I'm sure in some environment there's a way to dispose of that that's actually useful, because, again, it's not just a weak bark tea. It's charged with all this dissolved protein and minerals and stuff.
Do you have any last thoughts about this process? And yeah.
No, I think I think we're in for a bark tan revival, and it has certainly started. When I first started, I have a little pouch here that was made by some friends, Matt and Molly, from way back in the early primitive skill scene there. And they did the same thing that a lot of us did as brain tanners, is we would be preparing skins to brain tanning, and we knew about bark tanning. So it's like you gather some kind of bark, you cook it up, and you throw your hide that's prepared for brain tanning in there, and you cook it, pickle it, and then you take it out, and it's like, well, look, I made bark tan leather. And over the years, we've just, through people doing research and experimenting, we've just found out more and have become more sophisticated, and it finally has caught on. Like, for a long time, people just didn't do it. Like, even if it was known, there just wasn't enough information for most people to launch in and do it. So there was like a lot of small scale experimenting, but certain people have kind of pursued it and kept going with it. And now I see it really getting steam. Now I meet people all the time who do brain tanning and bark tanning.
And again, it's not because it's a new process. It's just that much of that, and you've told me before, some of the ways that people did this, we don't really know anymore. Like, that wasn't written down because it was kind of like a held secret, or, depending on what part of the world you're talking about too. But, like, we've kind of lost the connection to that process. So in a way, we are kind of literally reviving it by trying to figure out and experiment.
There are a lot more old resources than most people know about. I have a list on my blog, on my website, skillcult.com/free stuff. This is where I house like old PDFs of old books, and there's a whole huge list of tanning books in there. Some of them go back to the 1700s. My favorite is De Lalande, and this is a book he was a French guy that wrote about tanning, and he traveled all over and collected processes and wrote them down. And for the time, it's a pretty good technical manual, because they weren't usually very good back then. And it was translated by the Irish Tanning Society or something like that. But those books are a treasure trove of information that is just waiting to be dug into and rediscovered.
Mm-hmm. There's probably a lot out there that's in a different, not in English or whatever, too, or in some sort of library and not digitalized, and we can't find it. So
yeah, there's a lot of stuff in French and German, for instance, that I can't read that.
Mm-hmm. If someone wanted to start this process, where should they begin? Like, I know that, maybe a smaller hide, or, yeah, what would be someone's.
Well, what you need more than hides and tannins is information.
Mm-hmm.
So if you can go to a skills gathering where someone's teaching it, that's great. Some of the best resources I know are Lota's book, Lota Ram,
Right.
and she has a book on bark tanning. And then my videos are some of the best resources available on bark tanning right now. And they're a little bit incomplete. I'm just kind of like filling in gaps here and there as I go. I have a series of videos on making sharpening strops from scratch where I go through the whole bark tanning process of the deer skin. And that series alone is enough to, if you pay attention and take notes, you can do it from that. And I'll continue to be putting those out on my YouTube channel for sure.
Besides Lota's books, she has a couple out, right?
Right, she has one on fish skin and one on just tanning in general.
There's not really a lot of like books, mainstream manual type books out there. I mean, y'all's brain tan book. There's a few brain tanning books.
There's lots of brain tanning books, yeah, out there. Bark tanning. Besides Lota's book, there's a chapter in one of the old buckskinning books. There's this series called Buckskinning. They're these thick books of all kind of like mountain man type skills. But one of those, there's an article way back in one of those that I used to have on bark tanning. And that goes way back. That guy was doing that a long time ago. Otherwise, yeah, there's not too much. So until one of us actually gets a book out, or maybe a video course or something like that, those are the best resources. My videos are good, but again, they're not necessarily all organized. So you have to kind of dig and want it. You have to take notes and stuff, but there's a lot of information in there, and I'm always filling that out.
There's no substitute for really like doing the process or working with someone who's been doing the process too. Like, I think books and videos are really great, like adjacent to that. So, getting in there and trying it. I know with me, I was like some trial and error figuring it out too. So one person gave me a seed of information, then I just kind of took it and then learned what not to do and what looked cool, what seemed to work out. So
yeah, one of my major approaches to people with that and bark tanning in general is having talked to so many people and having made the same mistakes and seeing everyone make the same mistakes. It's like, this is what's going to go wrong. This is what you're going to do wrong. Everybody does it. Putting the thing in 2 week of a solution and then just leaving it there expecting it to be okay. That's a real common one. So yeah, there'll be more, relatively soon. And the problem with learning from someone else is if you don't go do it with them, it's kind of a long process. Right. So most of the skills gatherings and stuff, they'll do like fish skins or something that's kind of quick. But you can do goat skins and other thin skins in a week, less than a week.
Yeah, it's tricky to learn from somebody when you only have a few days, or like unless you're living with them or they're your neighbor. Or my experience, I lived in community with people who knew a lot more about it than me, and as they were doing it on their own, I would watch or like be like, "Why are you doing that?" I could ask questions, which I felt like was really helpful. So
yeah, well, that's what I like about video, and that's one of the reasons I've migrated to doing mostly video instead of writing, is that some things are just easier to communicate in person, and it's almost like I can anticipate what people are going to need and try to like head that off, and provided you can actually see things going on and throw in these things about like, this, don't do this is what's going to go wrong, here. So I hope to keep filling that out and provide at least that, which is available 24/7 to more and more people.
And you have a YouTube channel, and everything on there is pretty much free, right? And
yeah, I don't really hold any content hostage for money yet, except for my book. And if I do any more books, I'm really looking at, my intention originally with Skillcult was to provide as much free information as possible and hope that I would fall into whatever the new paradigm is going to be with information, because the old paradigm of kind of like using information as a product and creating these books and stuff and then selling them directly, I think is on the way out. I just think the new paradigm is going to be different than that, and we have to find other ways to be supported in our work. So I basically consider myself a independent researcher and self-reliance skills and stuff like that. And I think that I'm effective and I produce good information, but so far, I haven't really been able to make a living at it, and I don't get enough ad revenue on YouTube. I have Patreon, but between Patreon and a few other like small incomes, it's just not enough. So I probably will be doing some writing or video courses or something like that to make that work for now. But my preference is just to concentrate on what I do best, which is information, figuring things out, and presenting that information and being a teacher without having to worry about being a salesman and a marketer and trying to get things out of people to do it. So we'll see how
Mm-hmm.
that works out. So I do have Patreon now. You can throw money at me on Patreon to do whatever I do, which is
Super helpful.
use all kinds of things that I think are interesting.
And the book?
And they are interesting and they are useful. I hear from people all the time, like weekly people write me and thank me for putting information
Mm-hmm.
out. I hear from people all the time who are like, literally weekly, who are like, oh, I found your channel and I was interested in axes and I found it and now I'm grafting apple trees and I want to tan some hides and I burned some lime, and they're just like really excited about all this stuff. So, I know I'm having these ripple effects are going out and doing what I want to do, because that's part of my evil plan with the whole Skillcult project is to hook people in with certain things
Yeah.
and then get them interested in that, in other things and other processes, and just being involved in life and being excited about things, but walking through the world and seeing it as a landscape of resources, because we walk around every day, especially modern people, with no clue to the potential that is around us. And there's this sort of land based, self reliance, primitive alchemy of resources, of combining resources and making things happen. It's just intriguing in a different way than anything else. It's this whole thing with the modern obsession with survival, and there's a lot of fiction out, especially juvenile fiction about like survival and people in the woods and people who are either lost and have to figure stuff out, or people that have these like kind of like self-reliance skills that make them this sort of independent being. That's just super popular for a reason. This like speaks to something in us that's super basic part of our core, which is that we were made to interact with our environments, to understand those environments, and to be able to take things out of those environments and manipulate them to suit our own needs and wants. And that's what it is to be human. That's why we have these hands that no one else has. It's this interaction with the environment. You've probably heard of the term nature deficit disorder.
Yeah.
Well, I would take that a step further and say that we have a nature interaction deficit disorder, where we are supposed to be part of this process. We're supposed to be interacting with this. And instead, what we have is people walking around in city landscapes or their daily life where they have no clue about how anything works or how they could be an independent person in these environments without being dependent on, kind of being fed in stuff constantly. And you take those people and put them in the woods, and it's like, it's completely foreign. It's just like this completely foreign environment. So that's my evil plot, is to instill this idea of looking around us and seeing potential where people don't normally see any potential, because it's literally just, there's just resources and ideas and possibilities everywhere. And to introduce them to the feeling that brings to you when you start to understand that stuff, it's a unique way of being, and I think it's the way that we are supposed to be. And whether we end up back in some place where like this is how we live, and you're some kind of luddite running around and with no clothes on or something, or just skin shoes, it's just the idea and the feeling that you have this potential and that you've partially realized it, and that is a different way of being in the world. It's a more secure and more, I would say, I hate to say the word spiritually because everyone's going to think religion, which I don't mean at all, but just this sort of sense that you're a part of something a little bit bigger, which is your environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that whole like story that we are separate from nature, that we're not nature, was the very curious thing there, like that we're accepting that, and by accepting that, or or be believing that, we are kind of disempowering ourselves from participating in what we're supposed to be doing as animals.
Yeah, and I think ultimately it causes us a lot of neurosis, whether we know it or not, that we don't have that, in that we this is kind of what we're supposed to be doing, and we fulfill it in different ways, like being involved with some kind of handcraft or hobby where we learn to use our hands, and there's this like satisfaction of building things and all that stuff, and it's kind of the same thing. But you'll find with people, when they go that extra step back and experience what it's like to say, I see this a lot teaching primitive skills. String is a great example. You teach someone to make a piece of string, and it just blows their mind. Like you just see this kind of light bulb go on, and they're like, wow, I didn't think you could like take this stick, it's just like from the bottom up, and I have this piece of string, this like super basic useful thing. And that's a different experience. It's a different experience than going to the craft store and getting some thread and twisting it together or something like that. So I have a lot of other projects I work on. Tanning is just a major interest and always has been. And I have these mini missions I'm on. One is to get people to learn to graft and grow trees that are, produce multiple different types of fruit on the same tree. I have an apple tree with over 150 varieties of apples grafted on the same tree. I'm always encouraging people to do that. I'm breeding apples. I'm just interested in getting people interested in being involved in their own food supply, and not just growing it, but like the next step back is our involvement with variety selection and breeding, because there are very few people that are representing the interest of home growers as far as breeding goes anymore. Now it's all gone towards the industrial lines. So the apple breeder says, I want to grow this type of apple that will make it to the market. It's going to make the growers happy. It's going to make the shippers happy. It's going to make the grocery store owners happy. It's going to make the patent owners happy. And then, oh yeah, the consumer, well, we have to make them happy enough that they buy it, but that's it. And so the interests of home growers are not being represented. So that's another one. I just have all these little projects that I'm working on, and I'm always expanding into other areas. So I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, totally. All right, sweet. Well, yeah, you've mentioned your Skillcult website, you have Patreon, and is there any other ways that people can find you online?
Yeah, Instagram, I've been posting a lot there, and I don't post just pretty pictures and selfies. It's mostly information. I post this morning, I'm still in the process of posting a series on growing diagonal cord on apple trees, which is a restricted form of apple tree growing, for instance, but Instagram, I'm most active on Instagram, YouTube, and my blog.
Sweet. Well, thanks for sitting down chatting with me about bark tanning, and I feel like I've learned a lot myself too, so sweet.
Groovy.
This episode of the Ground Shots podcast was produced by Opia Creative. Our music is by Mother Marrow. If you'd like to help us continue to make this audio project a reality, consider becoming a monthly supporter on our Patreon page at patreon.com/ofsedgeandsalt, where we have rewards like entry into patron-only giveaways, additional audio interviews, extra educational content, and much more. You can also share our work and give us a review on iTunes. Visit our website at ofsedgeandsalt.com to see what else we're up to and a log of our episodes when they come out. Check out our show notes for information about how to find us and our guests. Until next time, y'all, thanks for listening.